在台北、台湾，我是 Jennifer。你现在收听的是谢北北时间。
谢谢大家回 Office Hour。今天呢，我们有一个很有趣的主题，可是呢，我们还是回到重点。今天就是要喝什么酒呢？
今天是，等一下，卡萨空茶，这是哪里的酒呢？
应该是智利吧？我没，还是西班牙？哦，是西班牙，是西班牙的，西班牙。对，
是西班牙啊，没有，是智利，是智利。智利。
OK， 好吧，之类的呀，因为这一支是叫做 Marqués de Casa Concha， 然后 Toro 其实是西班牙最大的酒商，然后智利如果大家有在喝酒的话是就是新世界酒，就是品质又好，然后价钱也很好的。其实如果纯粹是就是喝该开心的，我还蛮建议蛮推荐智利的酒。然后那这支酒很有趣的是，它是用一些比较当地的葡萄，它叫 Pais 跟 Consat。它是这两种葡萄，这个是一般我们所谓说旧世界什么波尔多、勃艮第。应该是没有在用，不是说这葡萄好坏啦，就是说在那地方可能种的情形不好，这是比较我没记错的话，这些葡萄是比较适合热一点的天气种的。
大叔长平常不是不太喝所谓的新世界的酒吗？今天为什么是拉错支酒出来，还是为什么今天我们喝智利的酒呢？今天怎么有这个荣幸呢？
不要这么说，这个应该说我没有不喝新世界的酒，可是我喝的比较少，两个原因。第一个是新世界有好的酒，可是那个都常常是比旧世界还要贵
被炒得太凶了。
对，那在这前提下，我想哇，那我就去找一些我觉得这个价钱比较合理的酒来喝。那另外一个是新世界的酒，他们其实有一些比较用心的酒商，那不见是他小像就刚才讲的那个空乔伊Toro，他们其实也蛮大的酒商，可是呢，所以他们做的酒品质是有的，而且是还蛮用心。可是他们有时候那个酒的产量过多的时候，就会有大叔长这种人会默默来收买
所以是从一个投资的角度看这个事情。
也没有说投资到肚子啦，这个对，
唯一正确的投资方法就是投资到肚子。
谢谢。
OK，
是对，所以我们今天我们有一个有一个 guest， 是 Tom， 那我们这个请 Tom 跟我们打个招呼。
大家好，我叫 Tom。
对，那大家如果没有听出来的话，那个 Tom 的英文比中文好，可是你知道吗 ？Tom 很可怕，我都跟所有朋友讲说，你在他面前不要乱讲，因为他其实听得懂。
这样子说啊，
所以 Tom 你喜欢这支酒吗？
都还不错啊。当然每一次我的 uncle 们问我来喝酒，当然陪。
Hello， 我们有另外一个客人，这位也是 Tom， 请进。好，那个，所以我们今天这个其实我们就直接进入主题。那我们最近大家如果有在注意新闻的话，其实那个脸书跟澳洲很公开的大的吵了一架这样子。那我想这件事情当然就是应该如果有在注意 news 的话，应该有发现。那这边也顺便讲一下，今天的这个Tom 是有个特异功能，也不是特异功能，他是澳洲人，在澳洲长大的，而且他虽然一直强调他不代表澳洲任何人，除了他自己以外说话以外，他就是我们的澳洲代表。
很压力啊。
没有压力。
对。那所以就说脸书这件事情，那我们等一下比较讨论就是会变成英文，所以先跟大家报备一下。那其实我们主要想讨论两件事情，就是说从一个澳洲人的角度，而且他自己在科技界其实也是混蛮久的所以就从一个科技，从一个 business， 从一个澳洲的角度，他这件事情怎么看？当然我们自己也都自己有想法有看法了那另外一个是我觉得在这件事情发生到现在，我 个人很好奇的是，因为这些很多相关的资讯脸书啊什么的，很多的资讯都是从美国的角度。或者说从但脸书这是不会有中国的 perspective 啦。可是就是很多新闻很多 perspective 都是要么就中国，不然就是美国。那不是说他们不重要，他们非常重要。可是反过来讲，就是说不管是从台湾或者是澳洲的角度，我们就是比较中 mid-size 的这样的
中型国家，
对。那因为其实我想大家也知道。台湾的经济体系在全世界是排前20名，
前20。
那澳洲跟台湾的人口其实是类似的，经济的 size 也是蛮类似的，所以在以脸书的这件事情，很明显的大家都最后都是要退一步。那所以就是说这种事情以后一定还会再发生。那从一个非美国非中国的角度，我们是就坐那边等死吗？还是怎么样？所以我们主要是想要借这个机会跟 Tom 讨论一下，从他的角度，然后看大家有什么想法。也就是还是那句话，就是阿北的世界里面，我们就是来闲聊，
就是我们讲话不负责任的意思吗？
我一向是讲话负责任，可是你如果把我的话当真的话，那你要为自己负责任了。
那我们对不起，我们以下的节目可能要转成英文，对不对
？Yes.
Okay. Tom, what's your take? Give us your thinking.
Right. Well, I think the very first thing is just like generally describe from your perspective what happened.
Right, absolutely. So Australia, like most countries in the world, has had a transformation in the media industry. It used to be that newspapers you bought at your local store or had delivered, and they earned most of their money through selling advertisements directly to advertisers. Then this little thing called the internet came along. And kind of
invented by Al Gore, by the way.
I believe so. And essentially destroyed that business model. And we've seen various attempts by media entities to move online. But the Australian government, mid last year, that's mid 2020 for those listening in the distant future, decided that they were going to have a crack at trying to save the media industry.
Right.
And they did that by creating a new law, which is called the News Media Bargaining Code. And basically what that did is it set up a mechanism to force technology companies to negotiate with news outlets to pay them for the privilege of hosting the news on their platforms.
But collectively or individually, because it's a two very different thing.
So basically, it's now one of the ministers in the Australian government's job, probably the Minister of Communications. He or she has the right to declare a major technology company is a source of news. So they were principally looking at Google, Facebook, these kind of large social media entities. And then once that declaration has happened, that starts a process where that tech company, Facebook for instance, needs to negotiate with media enterprises like Rupert Murdoch's NewsCorp.
So it's a one-to-one thing. It's not a collective bargaining type of...
That's right.
Wow.
So what it is, it was a way to... according to the government, it was a way to address the power discrepancy between these large multinational corporations and the,
the puny local things, yes, such as NewsCorp.
Indeed. And there are real problems with the news industry in Australia. In the same year, we saw the AP wire shut down, which really had the potential to affect a lot of particularly local news gathering.
Yeah, very much so.
And so this was the government's response to try and provide some extra financing into proper journalism. And there are a range of issues with that, which I'm sure we'll get into. But it was characterized one way by the media. It was characterized a very different way by the technology companies.
Naturally.
Effectively, they started referring to it as a link tax.
Link tax, okay. Because the link, you click on a link and somebody needs to pay tax.
That's right.
Like the death tax.
That's right.
And so you had various people involved in the internet industry coming out and saying, this is breaking the fundamentals of the internet. Why should someone pay money to someone else just for the privilege of linking to their website? And so this argument went back and forth for several months, up until it was looking pretty certain that the law was going to pass. And on February 17th, 2021, Facebook decided, we're done. Australia, you've ruined it. No news for you. And they blocked every single news outlet on Facebook. They prevented Facebook users from sharing individual links to news articles with their friends.
So on that point, how did Facebook define news link in this context? Because,
Well, I just happen to have the law open here, which is something that Facebook referred to.
It's a very Tom thing, by the way.
So they basically defined news as some content that reports, investigates, or explains issues or events that are relevant to Australian public debate, or issues of public significance at a local, national, or regional level. And you can hear that definition and understand just how broad it is. It basically
it's everything.
Anything and everything.
It's a catch-all, isn't it?
And so if you're a large technology company potentially facing fines of $100,000 per link,
right.
You've got to take some kind of action unless you can be certain of your situation. And so Facebook did. And what happened next was very interesting, because it turns out, just like Uncle San, you asked the question, what is news? It turns out it is actually quite difficult to define this. And Facebook took a very broad view. In fact, shutting down access to the National Weather Service information.
Well, it is of national interest.
That's right.
Yeah, that counts.
Prevented access to emergency services from posting information.
Oh my goodness.
And
but if I am not sharing, but I'm just posting, I am the emergency service myself, I can still post it, right?
Well, they blocked the pages. So if you were a particular emergency service, or you were the Bureau of Meteorology, you would log into Facebook on that day, February 17th, and find you could no longer see your posts, and you couldn't post anymore.
Oh, jeez.
And of course, they also had a bunch of other really amusing things, like several comedy websites were suddenly considered news.
And apparently some significant non-profit organizations were shut down too.
That's
on
absolutely
Facebook.
correct, Uncle Cha. And they complained immediately about receiving far fewer donations in that period of time. And the impact was significant. Depending on whose statistics you rely on, between 15 to 30% of traffic to Australian news sites came through Facebook, because they saw drops of about that amount once it was blocked. And this didn't affect people in Australia solely. They also prevented anyone outside of Australia from accessing news.
Oh, Australian news, right. So yeah, well, that makes sense, actually.
It was like Australia just didn't exist anymore. Which
it disappeared from the map,
some people debate whether it actually does exist. It's very far
Now
away.
you too know how it feels to be Taiwan.
I think in the future day we should talk about this existential question. In the old days, like if a tree fell in a forest and nobody saw it, did a tree fall?
That's right.
Now, if a country disappeared from the internet,
Does
did
it
the country
exist?
exist?
That's right.
Well, I think there are a few countries you can ask that about based on recent geopolitical events. But it's
That's
a
right.
Well,
valid topic worth
let's not go there. Right. And if I recall correctly, I think Facebook did not warn anybody, right? They just say, okay, this is off switch, it goes.
That's right. I'm certain that they did have some high-level phone calls with the government at some point before pulling the trigger.
5 minutes before or something, wasn't it? Like before they bombing Pearl Harbor,
one would assume they were trying to actually shape the law in a direction that was better for them. I do believe they did telegraph the potential of a move like that, but it would have been 6 months prior to them actually pulling the plug.
And telegraph in this is a metaphor, not an actual
right.
I just want to make sure, right?
Yeah.
And not through the diplomatic
This is
telegraph.
for the young people.
I thought you'd appreciate the reference.
Thank you.
Yes.
When I was a kid.
Right, and then you know when obviously made the headline around the world, and then the whole issue got resolved like in about a week or less.
That's right. So I think the block came in on the 17th of February, and by the 22nd of February, Facebook issued a press release that says, we've spoken with the minister, everything's good, they've accepted our position, and everything is going to be fine. And I do believe some amendments to the system were made.
Right. And both sides claim victory.
That's right. Yes.
A real good agreement.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's yet to be seen whether the agreement will actually pan out practically. But we have seen that both Google and Facebook have signed multi-million-dollar deals with various news outlets.
But I remember, like, the following week, Facebook put out some kind of press release saying that they are, quote-unquote, investing $1 billion in media. I don't know what that means exactly, but, you know, invest $1 billion media. These are the three keywords that would resonate at that time.
Well, I mean, I imagine it's something similar to a Taiwanese company saying they're going to invest $1 billion in an LCD plant in a certain U.S. state, right?
Once again, no comment.
It's a nominal value spread all over a decade or two.
And for the record, just like Tom, we do not represent any government or any
no,
entity.
we represent no one but ourselves. In fact, kind of think
I don't even represent myself.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay.
Right. So you know, I think so. Once again, really appreciate sort of Tom kind of providing some of the nuances and texture of the whole thing, but again, you know, sort of from the Australian perspective, I mean, it happened February, so you know, about a month later, give or take. I mean, on the ground, as it were. I mean, are people kind of happy with the result? I mean, I assume people still have opinions on what happened, right? You know, but in the result, is it okay, or people just like, well, we gotta, you know, itching for another fight?
Indeed. Well, I feel like Australians in general are quite pragmatic. They're looking for the actual outcome, and so I think it would be one way to characterize it would be that in general people would be annoyed at Facebook. Because it impacted their lives. They, for almost a week, were unable to share news with their friends. A treasured pastime for many. And they'd also be annoyed at the government for potentially being ineffective and kowtowing. So the core issue here is that in order to have a free and open democracy, we need a free and open media.
True.
And that needs to be funded somehow. Someone needs to be paying the journalists to go out there and get the stories. I don't think we can yet say whether this shocking event or whether the law itself will actually result in more money flowing to more investigative journalists doing great work. Because as was brought up by critics of the law, there is no requirement for the media outlets that are being paid by the tech companies to channel that funding into anywhere in particular.
Right. It sounded almost like a transfer pricing scheme, right? You know, it's like, okay, you're making too much money, and people who can vote are demanding some compensation. Again, I'm being dramatic in a way, but it does have that feel, because from what I have read, it's mostly about how NewsCorp, you know, kind of fit into the whole equation. And then, you know, I do have this lingering doubt about, but I assume there are local news outlets that's not a part of the conversation. So I mean, are people like concerned, or we just kind of like, what's going on?
Well, absolutely. I think that NewsCorp is a brand that you need to talk about in this context. If you listen, for instance, to former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who's called for a royal commission into NewsCorp, particularly as it relates to Australia's political
wasn't he
process.
the guy who wanted to turn Australia into a republic?
One of them, yes.
And he wants to do a royal commission. I'm sorry.
I
just find it ironic.
Yeah.
Sorry, you continue, please.
Absolutely. And so, yes, former Prime Minister Rudd has almost characterized NewsCorp as having a hand in his own election defeats, but also another of potentially more unbiased areas as well, looking at how such a large organization with a political agenda, as we see prominently in the US outlets as well.
Sure.
And what is the relationship there? And I think one of the questions that people ask when they're talking about this is, okay, so NewsCorp has all of this influence. Facebook has this platform. Should Facebook pay NewsCorp money for hosting NewsCorp content and giving NewsCorp the ability to disseminate their content widely? Shouldn't that be the other way around? And I think that it is a very interesting law in terms of how it's targeted, because if you read it, there's text in that law that actually refers to what it means to distribute news, and they've included wording like about ranking content, about adjusting the prominence of content, about displaying content differently to different users, and these are explicitly the activities that we know Google and Facebook for. Google has the famous PageRank algorithm, which determines the order in which search results are displayed on Facebook. Based on the number of likes, it will determine what content ends up in the news feed. And so, I think it's fair to say this is a very targeted law. But then again, if you are trying to solve a systemic issue with the financing of news, you've got to go after the people that have the money, right?
Oh no. I mean, I think. Well, I think and I will be the first to admit that it's so much easier to be an armchair policy analyst.
Sure. I dream to be one.
Oh, you don't need to dream about this. I'm doing it right now. No, I mean, I think Tom brought the good point. I mean, one is sort of the nitty-gritty, the sausage-making process of a policy, and I think there's something interesting to continue to watch. But I think the other issue is, how, again, sort of what I referred to, in an earlier part, where there is an extra issue of asymmetry as people who, policy wonks, I think that's the proper term, follow, for example, the US would every so often declare a country or an industry or, whatnot as manipulators, like currency manipulator or some other things. But, is always unique in the sense that the U.S. occupies a unique position in the world economy, amongst other things. So I think for me, it's particularly interesting to watch the dust up between Facebook and Australia, because, it's not obvious to me, and I don't mean any offense. Don't take this the wrong way, Tom. Is between Australia and Facebook, it's not obvious who's going to win.
No, I think that's fair. And I think this is, in effect, a proxy battle between the role of an elected democracy and the supranational governance of a multinational corporation that size.
Right.
And so maybe this is a question for both of you, wise uncles.
That's funny.
How should that relationship work? I mean, the US is fine because, in theory, if Facebook or Google is mean to the US government, they have some recourse there. For the middle powers,
or China for that matter, right?
For the middle powers, we don't. We need to rely on the international rules-based order. But do mega corporations have too much influence or power? Are middle powers struggling to work with that relationship? what do you see as being the future there? Is this just one instance of what we'll see in years to come? Or?
I'm guessing, I'm hoping and guessing at the same time that other countries, the other middle power countries like Taiwan and others, New Zealand, whatnot, should sort of take Philippines. Well, Philippines is a big country, by the way.
Oh, yeah, it's more than 100,000 or 100 million.
Yeah, so
population.
hopefully
like
there's
this
some shared learning there. Like maybe some sort of collective bargaining. Some sort of banding together, or a term. Uncle Sang here coined earlier over lunch is that maybe all these countries should just form a non-alliance meaning that they neither side with China nor with US, and they need to sort of learn from each other. I mean, I think if other medium powers begin to sort of take the cue from Australia, maybe it's a good start.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think, again, being sort of somewhat intellectually lazy, what I always try to do is look at what are some of the things, what are the parallels that has happened before. And, so I think two that came to mind. One is just in terms of, today, this is history still in the making, is, there's US, there's China, that's not in dispute. And then to some extent, there's the EU,
right,
which is, a collection of countries. And then there's, so I think there's, but obviously EU has its own problems, being sovereign states, how do they sort of bind each other? I think that's one issue. But I think the other thing is, if you look at Facebook as this sort of colossus, and again looking at the U.S. as an example, AT&T, Mobile, it provides a universal service. It's a utility, and the power of company like Facebook is sort of the network effect. Can you imagine, like, if everybody use a different phone and the phone do not talk to each other, then it's kind of pointless.
That's right.
And the same idea extends to company like Facebook. The reason why it's so powerful is because we are all on it. Well, my kids won't connect to me, but that's a separate issue. And so what happened in the U.S. The historic example was that the U.S. government decided to break it up, and then turn into baby bells, Mobile to baby bells. But again, I don't know how instructive it is, in a sense that EU today still has all kind of issues. I won't call them problem, but just, and it's understandable. We're all equals, and how do we deal with this? And then, the breaking up of Mobile to Baby Bell eventually still led to consolidations.
Sure.
So there's this tension between natural monopolies and all that. A third one, Uncle Jai and I, we kind of talk about is could sort of lend some framework is the carbon trading, right? The whole notion of externality. And for those of you who don't know, I'm a total geek when it comes to economics. Externality refers to when usually an entity can do usually bad things. So for example, I can pollute. And I, as a company, reap all the financial benefits, and as employees, yes, we kind of suffer, but hey, I'm making money. But everybody else has to deal with the pollution. That's the typical example you use for externality. And so, how do you deal with externality? And so to kind of focus on the Facebook example is that Facebook obviously is making a lot of money by doing all the things, and then it is the externality in this example is killing off the traditional media. So what are the things that you can do? And so again, being the economic geek that I am, the official classical answer is let's tax them so they internalize the externality.
Yeah.
Having said that, I don't know if any of this make sense.
Well, don't you think in a way the resolution in the case of Australia is kind of like that, except in a classical sense of tax, usually the payment goes to the government. In this case, the payment actually goes to NewsCorp.
It's the government forcing one.
Right. So maybe that's sort of in the generally right direction. Now the recipient, the entitlement payment, though, to me is kind of questionable. But that's
somebody getting paid,
right? Somebody's getting paid, right? So that's right. So the classical answer is always sort of to internalize the externality by some sort of tax, right? That's also the same proposed solution for sort of pollution, therefore the carbon tax, things like that. That's a good starting point. I don't know if it's a good answer, but it is certainly a good starting point because people need to sort of take into consideration that, okay, now if I'm collecting and transferring or linking all this data, I am going to be taxed on it. Therefore, there's going to be some sort of cost. Therefore, they have to sit down and make their financial decision based on data costing them something. So, that hopefully will nudge them towards a more, economically sensible solution. So that's one thing.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, I've been sort of thinking about this issue, and I think there are a number. So I think at a sort of policy level, I think. Based on the very limited research I have done, there does not seem to be a lot of framework to think through this. And what I mean by that is that a lot of discussion tend to be sort of reflecting popular sentiments, which is very important. I don't I'm not taking away from that, but it doesn't provide a framework to think it through. So in that context, I think thinking of this as an externality, and I think that even that issue is debatable whether or not this is a negative externality. But take that. Let's assume that's a framework we can think it through. Then I think again, focusing on from the perspective of Australia or Taiwan, sort of middle countries, there is a very interesting opportunity. In other words, the likes of Facebook, by definition, would pay the most attention to fit within the regulatory framework of the U.S. In the case of Facebook. In other words, their degree of freedom for maneuvering on a global basis actually is constrained by what the U.S. requires.
Right.
In other words, a very interesting economic analysis can be done is how much we can push the envelope so that Facebook does not change its behavior, but we maximize the tax revenue. I think that's a very interesting conversation, right? Even as a theoretical basis, it's like, how do we tax them? So it's almost like arbitraging this situation, and so I think in many ways, if you think of it that way, being sort of the mid-sized power has its advantages because we actually can run rings around the big giants.
The medium-sized countries could actually provide the data points, right? I mean, it's almost like, sort of constructing the indifference curves for companies like Facebook and others. Like, okay, so they already took this deal in Australia, so we know that they're going to try to do the same deal in other countries, right? For example, we know that's the sort of their minimum low bar.
That's right.
So that is, sort of one way.
Right.
That is one of the reasons why Facebook and Google and all of these large multinational media organizations paid so much attention to this particular
instance. Because it is setting a precedent.
Right. And I think it's interesting to think about Facebook as an entity that can be taxed and use the taxation system to manipulate the outcome to get a better outcome for the population of your country. Because we've seen already that they will just decide that they're going to annoy their entire user base in a country on the basis of one regulation. So I think as well as the successful, if you can call it that, outcome of having that negotiation between Facebook and NewsCorp and some flow of money there, we've also seen the extent to which Facebook and presumably other organizations like it will go in order to not be beholden to that law and regulation.
Right.
So where does that stop? I mean, Google has already pulled out of China. That's a massive market, and they took that decision based on regulatory concerns. So I think it's a balance. You can't see the taxation system as a panacea to fix
Absolutely.
all of those
Absolutely.
issues.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, well, I think, Tom, you brought up a very interesting point, which is, I mean, let's just for the sake of argument, let's say the framework of externality, et cetera, is good enough to as a starting point. But very quickly, I think we'll run into two issues I can think of immediately, right? One is, and again, let's use the real world example, tax regimes at the national level. There's a race to the bottom.
Right.
In other words, this country A or everybody charging 30% in corporate tax, for example, but country A decides I'm going to charge 25.
That's right.
And then everybody will rush to country A, and then country B goes, well, I'm going to charge 24, and et cetera, et cetera. So again, it goes back to the notion of sort of sovereign state coordinating their requirements, because otherwise it's very easy to do the divide and conquer thing. And again, there is no judgment on this. It's like, if I were Facebook, that's what I would do, right? So that's one. And then even after that, there is this famous or infamous notion, I think popularized by Paul Romer, of regulatory capture. Right, because at the end of the day, this is going to apply to very specific companies, and there's every reason that they will want to manipulate the rules of the game from the inside. And again, I would do the same thing over them. I mean, why wouldn't you do that?
Yep.
And then so again, I'm not saying, I'm not being optimistic or pessimistic, but interesting enough, all these issues are actually well understood. And so I think just again being having a luxury of being an armchair policy analyst, it's like, these are things we're gonna think about.
Right.
I don't have to propose it,
but I think we're at a juncture where you talk about sort of the politics, which is people feel like something needs to be done. I think there's enough of that already. I think the watershed moment was when Twitter decided to shut down a sitting U.S. president.
That's right.
Right. So now we are migrating to sort of the more nitty gritty, which is the policy.
Right.
And I think so far, I think we're hearing from several corners of the debate, but I think more work needs to be done there. And I think one is to look back to history to look for precedents, and then at the same time realizing that every situation is unique. And I think, again, while this time it may not be entirely different, but it is still subtly different from the previous cases, such as breaking a mobile, justice going after Microsoft, and other cases, right? So that's where the challenge is to recognize the similarities and understanding the differences.
Right. And I think again, hopefully we're kind of looking at this from understanding how everything came about, but I think we're trying to look at this from a non-US or non-superpower perspective. It has its challenges, but I think there are also a number of opportunities that would not be available if you are a superpower. And of course, naturally, I'm going to put Tom on the spot, being the resident Australia representative, to let him have the last word. So what's gonna happen? I mean, do you think that the populace of Australia have finally, what's the word now, woke? And they will lead a charge, not gonna let this happen again? Or do you think people are just gonna say, okay,
back to normal?
Should we change our name to Salmon something?
Well, I think there has been a relative wide recognition that there's some discomfort with how Facebook has operated. And we've seen that again most recently with their slight change to the terms of service to WhatsApp, which Facebook acquired. It's an instant messaging service like Line and Signal. So when we saw that configuration change, terms of service change, a whole bunch of people moved away from the product because they were afraid that Facebook were going to use their information and give it to businesses. And when you see that fear manifested in millions of people moving off a service that Facebook controls, albeit even indirectly, I think there's issues there. I think there are wider issues around how so much of our public discourse is happening on private platforms. And I think
it's a walled garden kind of concept.
You need to ask questions like how those are regulated. The Twitter example, where a private company cuts off access to
sitting
U.S. president. Right.
Now I've seen everything.
And it's not necessarily that the private companies want to do that. It's our governments have not necessarily, we as a society have not necessarily found a way to step up and solve these issues. So I think this is just the beginning of the debate. I think we're going to see more instances like this, and I think it remains to be seen whether this law will be effective in propping up one of the very important pillars of our democracies.
Wow. Speaking like a good representative for Australia.
A true little D Democrat.
Yes, indeed. Okay. So anyway, thanks to Tom, I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of dig into the issues. I mean, obviously, we're not here looking to solve the issue, but it is a pleasure to really just being sort of somewhat dispassionate, but kind of talk about issues and what are the different angles. So with that, I'm gonna switch back to Chinese.
开始讲中文了吗？
是，他们也可以讲中文，可以，对，所以谢谢大家今天听今天的 Office Hour。然后，那其实如果大家有什么 feedback， 有什么想法的话，也真的非常非常欢迎大家来脸书上跟我们互动，因为其实我们的想法比较是这些事情拿出来讲，其实比较有趣啦。那个是 so and also obviously if you're interested, we would love to get your feedback on our Facebook. And until next time,
until you get banned.
That's right. 所以这是谢伯伯时间的 Office Hour， 我是大叔桑，
我是大叔甲，
你是？
我是 Tom。
OK， 谢谢，
拜
拜。
未来没有高潮起落，也没什么看头，但希望你能懂，这就是我。